Woke ideology is Marxist. We have commonly heard this retort as woke ideology and activism has spread over the past few years. Is this assertion really true? And the answer, of course, is yes and no. It is doubtful that many proponents of woke ideology are thoroughgoing Marxists. Few have read the writings of Marx, fewer still have read the writings of the principal Marxists of the second and third generations, and even fewer have read the leading Neo-Marxist revisionists. So in this sense, we can say that woke ideology and activism, as practiced by most of its disciples, are not Marxist. They are not consciously aware of the historical outlook and the politics that they ultimately advocate and are disciples of. But while it is doubtful that many proponents of woke ideology adhere to any strict dialectical materialism as found in Marx and Marx's principal readers, many are indoctrinated zealots of Neo-Marxism, a philosophical school that emerged within Marxism after the horrors of World War II. So what is woke ideology? That is a question that can elicit many different responses from many different people. It suffices for us to answer the question with the practical reality of woke activism as we see it around us. Woke ideology can be understood in its broadest applicable sense to be the movement of anti-fascism and anti-racism throughout the world, but principally in the Western white world. Its strongest footholds are, of course, in Europe and North America, as well as Australia and New Zealand, with smaller pockets of woke activist politics in the more developed regions of South America. More to the point, anti-fascism and anti-racism in woke ideology are conceived as being one and the same. The worst racism of the 20th century was exhibited by fascism. Therefore, anti-racism necessarily entails anti-fascism, and anti-fascism necessarily entails anti-racism, since fascism is the most vicious and violent manifestation of racist ideology, both in the past and in today's world all around us. To be anti-fascist is synonymous, therefore, with being anti-racist. We can also extend anti-capitalist activism to woke ideology, though for many this is secondary to anti-fascism and anti-racism, but as we'll see, the anti-fascism and anti-racism of woke ideology is actually inextricably bound up with its understanding of capitalism and its anti-capitalist activism. So how did woke ideology arrive at this basic underlying premise that we see today, that politics and history is a battle between the forces of anti-fascism and fascism, anti-racism and racism? And the answer is of course, Marxism. Marxism provided the underlying premise for woke ideology as it exists today. During the 1930s, and especially the 1940s and then the 1950s, Marxism underwent an intellectual renaissance with the second and third generation Marxists, who had to grapple with the failures of Marx's prediction of scientific socialism and the proletariat revolution. Moreover, they had to come to terms with how a highly developed and capitalist country, Germany, didn't produce the proletariat revolution, but instead devolved into the horror of Nazism. There was also the need to explain why other developed capitalist countries, like Britain and America, didn't destroy themselves in a workers' revolution as Marx had predicted. This crisis within Marxism led to the rise of Neo-Marxism and post-Marxism, intellectual movements within Marxism that had to change and revise the classical Marxist paradigm to account for the recent developments of history and the historical experience that everybody lived through during the 20th century. The German Marxist and playwright Bertolt Brecht summarized the new Marxist understanding aptly when he wrote that fascism was, quote, a historic phase of capitalism, end quote. That statement by Brecht is, in its universal application, the new Marxism that we experience and live with today, that fascism is a historic phase of capitalism, which implies that the capitalist epoch will end in fascism. The key revision of Neo-Marxism was in how the confrontational politics before the eventual disappearance of all states and social groups into the homogeneous end-of-history communist utopia was no longer conceived as capitalism versus socialism, but fascism versus socialism, since, per Bertolt Brecht and the other New Wave Marxists, fascism was the historic final stage of capitalism. What did these new Marxists mean when they asserted fascism was a historical phase of capitalism? To them, fascism is the universal manifestation of violent class and racial hierarchy politics at the end stage of capitalism, when capitalism has morally degenerated itself and is on the verge of collapsing due to the weight of its own contradictions and oppressions. The capitalists and the little capitalists, the petite bourgeoisie, will come to form a reactionary alliance against the movement of egalitarian liberation and violently fight to defend decadent and dying capitalism against anyone and everyone deemed an enemy of the capitalist system. Fascism, as reconceived here, is the final breath of a dying capitalist system. Furthermore, this new Marxism underscored how racial hierarchy and resentment, the pillars that undergird the ideology of racism, helped to suppress working class consciousness among white workers who fell into the propaganda of capitalist ideology, which promoted patriotism, Christianity, and the Whig idea of economic progress to delude workers from their own plight. Racism is what fascism draws upon to gain its strength as the capitalist order collapses. Instead of allowing workers and the middle class to see the real culprit of their discontent and demise, which is capitalism itself, capitalism scapegoats various minority groups to establish a false consciousness, the fascist consciousness, which leads to fascist militancy and counter-revolution against revolutionary socialism and liberationism. Once this revision within Marxism is understood, understanding woke ideology now becomes easier. The woke insistence that all political opponents, all of their political opponents, are ultimately fascist, the woke insistence that their movement is revolutionary and liberationist, especially as it relates toward the scapegoated minority groups oppressed by capitalism, and the woke opposition to capitalism itself reveals its intellectual basis in the neo-Marxism of the post-World War II Marxist movement. In the here and now, woke ideology looks to dismantle all the structures of hierarchy and power within the developed capitalist world in order to prevent the rise of militant fascism. The elimination of the hierarchies and powers of capitalism, which will fuel, if they are not removed, the rise of neo-fascism as capitalism collapses under the weight of its own contradictions and oppression, is the guiding purpose of revolutionary politics. Because in the woke revolutionary mind, the end goal results from either two paths: the path of a violent confrontation with fascism, or the path of the institutional destruction of all the forces, the institutions, and the laws that would otherwise support fascism when it could emerge. Revolutionary socialist and liberationist politics, woke ideology, therefore, aims at dismantling all the forces and institutions which would otherwise be used, as we've just said, to advance and support fascism and fascist propaganda when capitalism collapses. What ultimately governs woke ideology and activism is the Marxist understanding of history and politics. That history and politics, which are ultimately one and the same since man's nature and destiny is political, is the confrontational struggle between oppressor, the capitalist turned fascist, and the oppressed, and how in this historical movement the oppressing system of capitalism degenerates and collapses into fascism, thus meaning the final battle of historical politics is between reactionary capitalism and racism, which is what fascism is according to Neo-Marxism, and progressive egalitarianism and liberationism, which is what socialism is according to Neo-Marxism. With this view of history and politics in mind, we can look back over the rhetoric and activism of what we have come to call woke and see how it very much falls into this neo-Marxist philosophy and vision. So while woke activists have not read Marx, no longer adhere to the classical Marxist view of dialectical materialism, and have probably not read the neo-Marxists who have created the outlook of history and politics that they have become indoctrinated adherents of, woke activists are very much following the neo-Marxist revision that has overtaken the broader Marxist mindset as a result of the history of the 20th century. What is woke ideology and woke politics? Woke politics is the view of history and politics that capitalism will collapse into fascism under the weight of its own contradictions, inequalities, and oppressions, and in capitalism's collapse, the capitalist order will scapegoat various groups of people, often those who are already oppressed by capitalism, as the cause of the degeneracy and decline within the capitalist order. This collapse of capitalism and scapegoating of various groups manifests itself in the capitalist epoch as fascism, which is the final stage of capitalist life. The way fascism protects capitalism is through racism, which gets white people and white adjacent communities and individuals to align with the decadent and declining capitalist system against the oppressed and scapegoated groups of people that fascism then violently seeks to exterminate as the last gasp of capitalism defending itself. Fascism and fascists are the ideology and the foot soldiers of the final defense of capitalism. The violence of reactionary capitalism, which is fascism, must be confronted by revolutionary socialist politics, the egalitarian and liberationist ideology of those who have freed themselves from capitalist fascist propaganda and who have allied with all the oppressed and scapegoated groups within capitalist fascist ideology. This final battle between reactionary capitalism in its fascist form and socialist liberationism is the historical epoch we are living in before the egalitarian utopia can be achieved through the eradication of capitalist fascism. Thus, in the woke mind, there are only two choices for people to take in politics. You will either choose to be on the side of fascist capitalism, or you will be on the side of egalitarian and liberationist socialism.